Welcome back to Youth in Podcast, the podcast where we discuss political happenings, current day events, and more. I'm your host, Alexander Smith, and I'm joined here today by the exceptional Stephen Fry. Stephen is an award-winning actor, comedian, writer, and activist. Alongside Hugh Laurie, he made up the renowned comedy double Fry and Laurie. Besides working in television, he's a prolific writer, having written over 4 novels and 3 volumes of autobiography. Fry is a brilliant debater and intellectual who is best known for his views on religion, political correctness, and liberalism. Today we'll be taking a deep dive on his beliefs in each of those realms. Mr. Fry, it's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a real delight to be here, but you must call me Stephen from now on. But I appreciate your politeness. It only makes me feel older.
And I'm also joined here today by my co-host, Elia.
Hi, Stephen. So our nonprofit Youth in Policy is a nonpartisan youth-led organization, and our goal is actually ending the toxic political climate that's really threatening civil discourse. So you said that our country was founded upon the principles of the Enlightenment and a respect for free thinking, and these are the values of and the lifeblood of a liberal society. And I do believe they're becoming more constricted each day. So I'm curious to know why you think America is in this current state. And do you think these are values that are completely lost now or can be recovered?
It's such a good question. And of course, if I felt I had an immediate and comprehensive and convincing answer, I would be the most valuable person on the planet. Naturally, I don't have an answer. And there are different ways of looking at it. One which always appeals to me is the historical, which people often think is looking backwards. But of course, in order to understand history, you have to look backwards to some degree, but it's a way of looking forwards as well, because it reminds us of the things that are permanent and things that are temporary. It's very easy when you live in a particular, if you imagine that history is, all our past and future is a long, dark corridor, and there's a spotlight shining on the period we're alive now. And the past that we've been through is dark, and the future that we're going to is dark. And we tend to think of this area that's spotlighted, this modern era, this early 21st century, its problems and its issues we think must be unique because we're unique, and technology and science and society and globalism and all the things that are happening in the world have contrived to make this period exceptional. And therefore looking backwards is kind of America when I'm talking to you now. And I spent plenty of time here. It is an exceptional country. Last century is often called the American century. There's lots of talk about how this coming century is clearly going to belong elsewhere in terms of primacy, economical and military. Obviously, China and India and Russia and so on are leading candidates for taking over the poison chalice of being world leader. But nonetheless, America culturally and in every other sense is still an enormous force in the world, particularly for people who speak English and live in the West like me. So Australians and Britons and Canadians, we're all in thrall of America. And America, yes, was founded on principles of harmony and enlightenment and free thought and a bold new experiment in which the old hierarchies, the hierarchies of ecclesiastical power, bishops and popes and right down through the parishes that held sway over every soul in Christendom, and the aristocrats and the kings and the new arriving class of industrial, industrial leaders, as it were, employers, managers. This new experiment was going to make sure that individuals were equal and that they were regarded and respected as absolute parts of the democracy, no less valuable than even the president of the new country. But what's worth remembering is that this noble experiment, which is expressed in language which is so similar to the architecture of Washington, elegant white columns of perfect, harmonious thinking, setting out something beautifully, elegantly, in almost as if the words were made of marble and carved into the Constitution. What could go wrong? It was such a mighty experiment. But what was interesting is that it didn't take a long time. It was instant. The moment virtually America was formed, it started to fracture. And it puzzled Americans. By the time Oscar Wilde was visiting in the 1870s or early 80s, the Civil War was just over. And people said to him, Americans, as if they were as baffled as anyone else, why do you think this is such a violent country, Mr. Wilde? Because in an incredibly short time, this noble experiment had wiped out the Plains Indians in an act of genocide for which America has still not really come to terms. You know, the handing out of smallpox-infested blankets deliberately to the Sioux people, for example. I mean, there are lots of examples of quite monstrous violence towards Indians, as they were called. There was violence in the workplace. There was the rise of gangsterism, and murder rates were incredibly high. Death of children, starvation, all the violence of the carpetbaggers after the Civil War, and the Civil War itself, which was the bloodiest war that mankind had ever seen. How could this happen to a country that was founded on principles of peace? And to this day, this legacy exists. America is simultaneously known for the noble nature of its ideals and the expression of those ideals in its Declaration of Independence and its Constitution, and the extraordinary violence of it as a country, the murder rate, the guns, the imprisonment, the fact that health is not as good as it is in most neighboring countries. I mean, Cuba has higher rates of literacy and health outcome than the United States. So there's always been a problem about America, for all that we can agree that it's a magnificent country and has contributed to the world in culture and in so many ways that it can be proud of, and has been a leading example of what democracy can be. It has also been a leading example of what democracy mustn't be. And it's as if from the very beginning, it's torn itself apart. And I'm giving you a very long answer, and I'm sorry, this is terrible. It's not a conversation at all. I'm just starting to lecture. I will finish in a second by saying that I suppose what I've been thinking about a lot is that America has never really decided on the fundamental difference between living politically as a society or adhering as a country as lots of individuals. There's individualism, atomism, you might call it, which believes that the individual has primacy, that no state, no capital, no county, no federal government has any business prescribing the limits of individual freedom. And that is a very strong American idea. New Hampshire has as its slogan, live free or die, to which I always want to go, oh, okay, that's really? If those are the only two choices, well, I suppose we'd better die then, hadn't we? Certainly when it comes to COVID, live free or die, it's exactly right. But, this idea that, and there is another way of looking at the world, which is that by grouping together, and as a society, not just as a society, but as common interests together, by race, by outlook, by sexuality, by religion, by all kinds of tribal, clannish qualities that we can see, we can clump together in groups. And this idea of group living or individual living has never been resolved, especially in America. And I think if you look at all the problems with the right-wing nativism of America at the moment and its obsessions with things like guns and, at the moment, not wearing masks, for example. These are all to do with this cult of individualism, and how no group, whether it's the police, the army, doctors, scientists, people with knowledge, special knowledge of some kind or training, has any right to tell me how to behave or what to do. And anybody who does is an elitist, is a snob, is beating me with their so-called learning, and those on the other side think of, I'm not an individual, I'm a member of a class, and it's the class black, or it's the class gay, or it's the class Jewish, or it's the, you know what I mean? It's all about that. And it's this strange problem of identitarianism. And each side thinks the other is the identitarian in a way. So if you're on the left, you think of the right and white separatists as being identitarians. They're obsessed with being white. They're obsessed with the rights of being white and of being so-called American. They're all identity groups. But if you're on that side, you look at the left and all you see are gays and blacks and Black Lives Matter and Me Too and so on. So each side thinks the other is guilty of a crime which it must be guilty of itself. So it's really, there is no difference, Elia, I suppose is what I'm saying. Ironically, there is a huge amount of similarity on the extremes, that they're both obsessed with the value of their own identity over and above what it is to be generally human. And I suppose that's what most upsets me and what most toxifies the culture. I will now shut up. Sorry, you've probably got lots of things to say.
Oh, no, of course. And I'd certainly agree with you in what you said before, that, America's always had problems like this. And it's certainly not the first time we're seeing issues like this. But I want to go back and dive a little deeper, something you just said, and ask why free speech is an issue that the right wing in America, the self-proclaimed right wing, is much more concerned with protecting. I think there are two things to say. One is freedom is immensely important to the right, and they would think, well, surely it should be important to everybody. But for some, the purpose of government, the purpose of coming together and living as a society or a country or a group or a community, is to make life fairer and easier and happier. So the end points to the left are fairness, justice, happiness, equality, lack of poverty. Freedom itself is not an end point. You can't do anything with freedom exactly. You wander around, you're in an open field, there are no hedges, so you can walk for miles. That's good. But the reason freedom is good is because confinement and imprisonment and control are bad. But I'm always amazed as a European that freedom of speech in cases of law is more important than the justice of the case. In other words, a lawyer can appear on the nightly news talking about his case, which can prejudice the case, is listened to by family members of juries, and I find that extraordinary. And Americans will say, but it's the First Amendment. Freedom of speech is the most important thing in the world. And I think, well, is it? Surely the only reason freedom of speech is important is because disallowing it is so disastrous. But it is not the end point to have everybody saying whatever they want all the time. That's not the definition of a happy society. I do think it's incredibly important that people be allowed to say what they want, but I also think it's important for them to be told to shut up under certain circumstances, like in a court case. And in the famous example that people always give when discussing freedom of speech, you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre when it's a lie, because you can kill people.
They can stampede. It's not freedom of speech to broadcast lies that are dangerous, for example. Obviously, it seems to me. And similarly, restrictions, controls, guidelines, regulation in industry and safety in the environment aren't a particular problem to me. Because, one can presumably legislate against this control or not. But for some people, it is an absolute red line. The very word regulation means interference and is a bad thing. And I suppose you have to impute a weird motive to those who are laying down laws, say, for the regulation of movement of capital in and out of countries, or not allowing insider trading in the stock exchanges and the share markets. I mean, they're so obvious. You've got to have rules like that. And similarly, you can't allow an individual citizen to own nuclear weapons. So, and that's obvious, and no one doubts it. But all this is a reminder of the obvious philosophical truth that there are lines we draw. We draw lines. We say, yes, you can own a gun, but that gun has to be described. If it gets to above a certain size and becomes some enormous thing that can only be held on a lorry so that it's a military device, it's a gun that shoots huge shells 300 yards or a mile away, you can't own that. So you've drawn a line. So this idea that freedom is indivisible is obvious nonsense. It's always divisible. You say you can go this far, but no further. You can own, let's say you can own a small gun, a handgun, but you can't own a nuclear weapon. We can all understand that. So you can say things that are irresponsible, flagrantly disgraceful, and nobody minds. But if you say something that's dangerous, that hurts other people and can cause violence, then people do mind. So it does mean that in the culture, you have to, if you are a responsible, boring, middle-of-the-road centrist kind of person, you have to accept that the world is bound in treaties and rules and regulations and laws, which are complex and difficult, and they have to be justified, and it's terribly easy. Bureaucracy, it's Kafkaesque, it's red tape, it's all there done to bind up the poor innocent John Q. citizen, and to read motives into those who are trying to organize it. But once you undo the mechanisms of the state to the extent that you claim a purity of ideological outlook to do with freedom, in which anything that gets in the way of it is the enemy. Once you do that, then essentially everything collapses. And this is what's in danger of happening, is that people are beginning to doubt the need for structures, for boring, logistical, bureaucratic, systemic structures that hold society up, that organize things, that have rules about the size of a bridge or a tunnel, that are very, very dull and very technical, but without which society literally falls apart. I mean, the bridges fall down, the roads, the potholes collapse, things don't get paid for, things aren't safe, things go wrong because there's no law. And it looks, how do you romanticize a belief in something as dull as a well-working, as a good state, a country that has civil servants that get on with their jobs quietly and without threat and do their best, and everybody trusts that they're there to do their best. The moment that genie's out of the bottle, in which everybody who has anything to do with the state is deep state, is an enemy of the people, is doing it for their own nefarious ends, whether they're Jewish ends or lizard ends or vaccinating ends or implanting things in you. And once you start imputing motives to people like that, there's no way you can go. There's just no way you can go. And unfortunately, what won't do is for the left to say, oh, well, we have to understand the right when they talk nonsense like this, when they spread these conspiracy theories and talk about the world in those absolute lights and so on. We must understand them. Well, yes, but if we stop believing in things that are true and evidence-based, empirically demonstrable, if we start to say, just so that we don't seem elitist snobs, so we don't commit the hillbilly elegy mistakes of thinking that, that it's all just white trash and they're all stupid, they're all well educated, and therefore we must just mock them. Instead, we have to understand them and say, yes, you've got a point of view. Well, there is no point of view to anti-vaxxing except ignorance, foolishness, or malevolence. It's spiteful or it's stupid. There's no in between. There just isn't. And it's unfortunate that your generation are the ones who are going to have to stand up for things that matter and mean something. There's my phone going. And I won't do that grievously awful thing of, sorry, just turn that phone off, that awful thing of which people of my generation do, which is simply apologize for having screwed the world up and saying, I do appreciate that it's very difficult for you young people. But there is a strong feeling that that it is up to you. That's why I'm very happy to do this podcast, because it's so wonderful to think there are young people who are serious, by which I don't mean pompous or take themselves too seriously as individuals, but who have a real passion and zeal for looking at how the world is and how it might be and what's going wrong with it, and not being satisfied to sit on the sidelines. So maybe you can tell me where you stand on these things. Do you think that we're just all going to have to be very polite and understanding to each other, or that we're allowed to have a real contest of ideas?
Of course not. And I really agree with you in that we have to, stand for truth against just blatant ignorance. And again, these are principles of the Enlightenment, Kant, Voltaire, and this respect for free speech. But as a liberal who believes that both sides should be embodying these principles, I do feel like it's more than just drawing a line where free speech becomes dangerous for the left. It's drawing a line where free speech becomes uncomfortable at all. So I'd like to ask, do you feel like it's just drawing a line for free speech being uncomfortable, or principally are we just restricting what can and can't be said?
I'd always rather that free speech was not restricted, but I think there are, and I go back to, it goes back to John Stuart Mill and on liberty, doesn't it? And on trying to establish these first principles of how free speech can work in a complex society of interconnected, clashing groups of people and interests. And, that hoary ethicist's example of shouting fire in a crowded room it's expressing this idea that speech is it can be loaded. It can, language can be an arsenal of weapons, and in the same way that it's fine to let people use language amongst each other in circumstances where they kind of know what's going on, but to use it to coerce, to encourage violence, to shame, humiliate, disgrace people, it's very difficult because it's a question of scale. Teasing someone in a schoolyard, that child can be very upset, but a teacher can intervene, and a teacher can see what's going on in the schoolyard and separate them. But where someone a child is humiliated and shamed and bullied by thousands, or in their mind of tens of thousands, and they then go and hang themselves, there is clearly a difference that has to be understood about different kinds of speech. Because we understand that printing a headline in a mass market newspaper is not the same as speaking in a bar. One of them is a message to a mass of people, which has power, which can affect people, can make people move, as is a radio broadcast. So when the Hutus and the Tutsis start shouting at each other to kill and calling each other cockroaches, using the same language that Goebbels and Streicher used in the 1930s to whip up anti-Semitism, to dehumanize. When language and media, broadcasting media, are used to do that, then regulation is clearly necessary, because it's being used not as speech, it's being used as weaponry. It is just a form of weapon. And that was the radio in the days of Goebbels and Streicher. Well, it's now Facebook and Twitter and everything else. And so I think it's inevitable that Facebook in the next year and a half will be treated as a publishing entity, a platform, not as a purely distributive platform that has no responsibility for the texts that go forward. So I think they'll be able to do it. But I think, yeah, I mean, the problem is, I've sort of written this before, is there aren't any grown-ups. You know, there's a whole world of British and American and indeed world fiction and fantasy, like The Wizard of Oz and things like that, which is all about the fact that behind the curtain, sometimes there isn't a grown-up. The Wizard of Oz is all about that. Who is this wizard? We must go and see him. He will solve all our problems. And it turns out it's just a fake. It's a con. There's nobody there. And the message is you have to sort your own problems out. Well, we're used to having figures to look up to, whether they're Nelson Mandela or Gandhi or Einstein or Albert Schweitzer, or, you know, there's usually been a selection of people on the planet who are a locus of authority, and whom we can respect and to whom we listen. And there were organizations, flawed, like the UNESCO and UNICEF and all the various organs and agencies of the United Nations and other global bodies, NATO if you're in the West and so on. And they were not perfect, but there was a sense when they met that, yeah, these were the grown-ups and they could fix stuff, and we'd read about it and we'd sort of give our opinions and so on. And it's not that we knew our place, but we deliberately voted and lived in a democracy in order to give that responsibility to people we could entrust. And there is no longer a feeling that you can entrust politicians or any class to run things. On the other hand, we don't run them ourselves. We merely pull them down, destroy them, make fun of them, and do all the things that are very easy to do to undermine the dignity and respect of our public servants. So no one is going to want to be a public servant. I mean, I don't know if you, Eli, or you, Alexander, if you want to be public servants when you're a little bit older, are you going to go do, the American thing is to get a law degree and then to go to the Southern Poverty Center, or to the Southern Poverty Law Center, or to the ACLU, or to, depending on your politics, to some other group, and then you find somebody and she's going to become the next big congresswoman in your district, and you become their chief of staff, and then slowly you become a politician yourself. But maybe you don't want that. Maybe you still have enough belief in the system to think that that's something you can do and make a difference in. Do you? Is that your plan?
Well, or Alex, you can start, because I'm actually only 15. So. Are
you really? My goodness, you have got a way to go. Wow.
Got away with
and I'm only 17 myself.
Good gracious.
So, Yeah, I know. We both definitely look a little older than we are.
Yeah,
I plan to go FBI, get my 20 years in, and then go into politics.
I
I
like that.
definitely see. Thank you. I appreciate it. A lot of people definitely ask, "Do
Mm,
you still have faith in the system?"
mm,
And I say
yeah.
that's a really good question. Um, there's a lot of factors at play, and just because you don't have faith in the system doesn't mean that you can't fix it. And a lot of people think
Yeah.
that.
No,
Definitely.
that's right. I mean, I occasionally take some sort of solace from the environment, which is an even wider problem and one that seems even more disastrous in the fatal nature of the direction it's traveling in. It seems likely that there will hardly be an environment in 80 years' time, say. But I've done quite a few things involving Fauna and Flora International and groups that help around the world. And I remember about 10 years ago, there was this plan to conserve a small area in the Caribbean Sea, which had become totally bleached and basically desertified, and no one was allowed to fish in it. And the idea was that in 10 or 15 years, it would slowly become regreened. What was fascinating was that within a year of it being left alone, it roared back to its original state, and it was fine. Everything found its balance with amazing speed when it was left alone. And nature's a bit like that. Now, we can't rely on the fact that our institutions and systems for government and for the protection of individual rights and for the advancement of those rights and so on, we can't assume that they're going to survive whatever happens, however dangerously they're tinkered about with or neglected. But I do think it is also true the speed with which humans can recover is akin to the speed with which nature can recover. A good example is to look at any movie made in the mid-40s in Europe. Films like The Third Man is a masterpiece of a film set in Vienna, and a couple of Billy Wilder films set in Berlin, for example. And if you look at the location of, if you look at Berlin in 1945, it is just rubble. The place was absolutely trashed. The Russians from one end came in and destroyed everything. The British and Americans had carpet bombed the city. Every street, every avenue was just piles of rubble. You look at the film of it and you think that's it. There's no more Berlin. But within 5 years, there was the Brandenburg Gate was back to its original pristine state. And in 10 years, and then in 15 and 20 years, no Paris. And it was things can, and this was a polity that had gone from the flight of the Kaiser in 1918 to the Weimar Republic, and Rosa Luxemburg and the small communist experiment, to Nazism, to being split between communists and Westerners. It had undergone every conceivable agony that a country could go in. And within 15 years, less than that, Germany had gone from being the sick monster of Europe, destroyed and humiliated, to being the leading democracy in the entire area. I mean, both economically and socially and culturally, it had recovered incredibly. So these are important things to remember when things, look grotesque. Human beings will find a way to bring about what they need to even things up. The reason I paused there was I was thinking maybe part of the problem with social media is nothing more than self-consciousness, is that we are so aware of our role as individuals in the whole nature of democracy. We know, because we have a voice in Instagram and Twitter and whatever other platform it might be or service it might be, that somehow we're all very self-aware. And I was thinking that because there was an experiment that was done in the 60s that I love by those behavioralists who ran rampant in in those days, indeed famously at Stanford. And this is, if you put a load of mice on a tray on the water, choppy water, reasonably choppy water, and they're on a Perspex tray, a little clear plastic tray, and they run around at random on the tray, and the tray stays afloat because they run around randomly. So they're, it's perfectly happy. It'll stay afloat for hours. If you scale it up to humans and put humans in such a tray, it sinks immediately because the humans think they can control it. They see that it's tipping one way, so they all run in the opposite direction and immediately sink it. So self-consciousness is very often the thing that brings around the destruction of stability, that nature works because it unself-consciously gets about, everything finds its level in the same way as water does. It just goes down to the sea. But once you start trying to control it, like trying to control nature, you're constant. That's whack-a-mole. You're playing whack-a-mole with the nature of nature, with the fact you think you're helping this species, but it will destroy that one. Oh, you go over there and help that one, you destroy this one. And the same in our politics. If we think we can control, and I'm not saying everything should be laissez-faire in economics and everything, just let it all, go wild, but maybe part of the problem with the present age is that everybody has a stake in it. So everybody's rushing towards one end to help things, and it tips it up over the other end. There's just too much self-awareness, and that if we just got on with living, kept our heads down and lived, kept our nose to the wind and our eye to the skyline, as the man says in that film. Anyway, sorry, I'm babbling again. What was that in answer to? Who knows?
You mentioned a little bit about social media and how we're talking about Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And a lot of people say that with the evolution of social media, we're seeing an evolution of discourse, but it feels like the opposite, because on Twitter alone, you get 280 characters per tweet, something like that. So you have a very limited response in your conversations, and eventually somebody's going to stop responding, and then people are going to get more angry about it. And so in reality, it feels like we're having this shift and this divide. And we're seeing the realms of allowed opinions not only expand, but kind of form a hole in the middle where you're not allowed to have that opinion. But one definite way that people are splitting is in the ideas of theism. In America alone, from 2007 to 2014, the group of people who identified as atheists doubled.
Yes,
that's just in America alone. We're also seeing, though, a lot of people go to kind of the religious extreme where they're saying, I can't wear a mask, as we talked about COVID a little bit. I can't wear a mask because God's green air, or, this is God. If God wants me to die, I'll die, or something like that on the very extreme end. Do you think that, as you say, social media is kind of a weapon in free speech and political correctness? Do you think religion is kind of another weapon that people use in order to push the ideas of dangerously free speech?
I think there's no question that can happen. And I have very little quarrel with individually devout, pious people. I mean, that's their business. It's nothing to do with me if they go to chapel, church, mosque, temple, whatever, any time of day, and fall to their knees and talk to some spirit they imagine to have created the world, and it makes them happy. Who am I to tell them otherwise, or to mock them even? It's cruel and stupid. On the other hand, the moment their assertions are pushed into the public space and used to control others, like to control education and how children are taught about the world, then obviously I do get a bit antsy and a bit worried. And that has always been, I say always, that's certainly been the case for the last 100 or so years. And in my lifetime, yes, there was a general sense that religion was a sort of large amorphous pressure that bore down on children in schools and things in Europe, where we don't have the separation of church and state quite so self-consciously as you do in your constitution. The first thing you do at school, there'd be hymns and prayers and so on. And of course, counterintuitively, is why I think Britain is so completely irreligious a country, because we have an established church, so nobody takes any notice of it. Whereas in America, you have thousands of churches, all tax exempt, all jostling in an ecosystem which is akin to an economy for, you know, corporate status and for the big bucks, and to reach the most people, to get the most, nowadays we'd say clicks, I suppose, religious clicks, and with it comes money and power. And a lot of it is simply snake oil. It's for money, and you can laugh at that or hope that people expose it and that it gets shown up for what it is, the faith healing and the nonsense of sending in money and so on, and saying God wants you to give up your money, all that stuff. But then when it comes to, where it really upsets me is when it comes to influence on the school curriculums and on what is taught and on what books are allowed in states, on literally book burning in Texas of well, whatever it is. I mean, it's comical. It's, you know, Harry Potter or something as satanic literature. I mean, it's so preposterous that you kind of ought to laugh. But it's unfortunately the case that there are still lots of children who are brought up to feel guilty and ashamed of who they are through not just their sexuality or anything. It could just simply be their desires generally, their sense of being a frothing, fizzing, expectant young person trying to engage with a frightening and an astonishing world, a world where they've, oh, yesterday I discovered the poems of Emily Dickinson or John Keats, and then I discovered this music, oh, this Jimi Hendrix, this Sidney Bechet, this Beethoven, whatever it is. Something has moved me profoundly in the world and made me extraordinarily excited about being alive. And apparently there's no place for it because it's more important than I read the Bible. And this is the truth. And what I just read about, you know, Newton or Wallace or Einstein or you know, Darwin or whatever, I must put aside, and that worries me a great deal. It would worry me if a child in a scientific household was told he wasn't allowed to read the Bible. That would be peculiar, and I don't think it's likely that it would happen. I mean, there may be some atheistic scientists who are so priggish and tyrannical that they wouldn't let their children discover about, but nearly always it is unfortunately religion that makes these extraordinary statements about the future of the world, the beginning of the world, and the nature of morality and human behavior that is acceptable and unacceptable. And the only way, the exciting thing, I mean, if they made those assertions and said, now let's discuss them, then fabulous. And some splendid religious people do that. They will go to a class of children and say, this is what Christianity says. It says it absolutely, and it says it with conviction. But is it right? Let's have a look. Let's think about it. What do you think? Then that's fine. If it's all, but when it comes from parents or teachers or faith schools or, you know, certain institutions and churches and so on, and it comes down as a word that cannot be challenged, I find that deeply distressing. And it's strange that fundamentalism in religion still exists and is associated with a political fringe that supposedly hates being told what to do. They make an exception when it comes to religion. They don't want an elected government telling them about taxes or about having to pay for hospitals or defense forces and the military. They'd rather go, you know, they'd rather go into some strange dugout hideaway in the hills than submit to such statehood. But they're perfectly happy to be told by a pastor or a priest of some kind what to wear, whether or not they're allowed to have tattoos, if they can have a foreskin or not. I mean, all kinds of utterly bizarre assertions made by people on the basis of no evidence except the precedent of folk memory and texts, which is an absurd way to go about things. But unquestionably, it has huge power, and there's money behind it, and that's part of the problem, isn't it? Is the huge amount of money behind it. It's the power it has over the Republican Party, and to some extent the American culture in terms of things like network TV and so on. You know, I can remember having done programs where you couldn't say "oh God" or something as an expression on network TV. I was thinking, well, that is very peculiar. But yeah, so it's a tricky one. Religion, I think, my own view, with all questions of progress, political progress, whether you're talking about it as progressivism, is that it's probably not 2 steps forward and 1 back. It's probably more like 3 steps forward and 2 back, or 4 steps forward and 3 back. But progress is made. It's painful and it inches along. I mean, a very good example is one that obviously matters to me a bit because it's, you know, I've lived it, but sort of same-sex marriage. It was inconceivable when I was your age that I could ever marry someone of my own gender publicly and openly, and, you know, introduce him as my husband, and he'd introduce him, you know, and people wouldn't bat an eyelid, and you'd get them on Jeopardy. You'd get a couple of men or a couple of women, though, can I wave to my wife, a woman would say, and Alex Trebek go, oh yeah, hi, and, you know, just completely normal. But if you go back 15 years when these things were being fought state by state, the language that was used was so extreme in their opposition to it. People would you know, crucify themselves rather than allow such abominations in their state. And now they'd look an idiot if they fussed about it. I mean, there may still be people who do. And of course, we can never be sure that you know, you won't go backwards on these things, but generally speaking, nobody gives a cuss anymore. And that's just as it should be. And you know, the legalization of cannabis, you may stand on another side for that, but it's another example of something that was inconceivable and has been liberalized in quite a lot of states now, certainly in California, where we are, Colorado, you know, the whole of Canada, Portugal, other countries. And as always, the world didn't come to an end. The mountains didn't slide into the sea, and it wasn't the end of all decency and family values and coherence. And far from it. The crime rates went down and in terms of family values with gay marriage, you know, children of same. In fact, rather than worse, and there is, you know, just nothing to see here, as the old cliche has it. We could all move along and look at some other area that needs to be looked at, and that's the way progressive politics works. And I'm here speaking on behalf of progressive politics because it's all very well for me to call myself a centrist, which I suppose I am. I react pained with the extremity of language on the left when it comes to, you know, when it comes to tactics more than really strategy. The strategy is fine. I understand they want justice here, justice there, equality there, but the tactics very often are bruising and alienating. And I worry that I just want the left to be a bit smarter in the way that it argues for things that shouldn't need much argument for, really, for you know, reductions in poverty and unhappiness and pain and squalor and pollution, and, you know, all these things shouldn't really need much explaining, and nor should they be screamed in people's faces. If somebody screams in my face, it's very illogical, but I will want to do the opposite of what they want me to do, even if what they're screaming in my face is sensible. The act of screaming is so unpleasant that it actually turns you off. And I think this is a huge side to the political debate that is completely overlooked. And that's and it makes me sound very squalid when I say it, it's the PR side of it. It's simply the bad PR. The left should be smarter at communication. It should be more self-denigrating. It should realize how dumb we all are, that, you know, actors in particular, people in my profession, actorvists as they're called, they should know how bad it sounds when someone who is paid, you know, $12 million a movie starts, you know, talking in barely literate English about how they want to change the world. And I'm not saying you should ban actors from speaking like that. Why should you? They've got every right, and it's charming that they want the world to be better, but just a bit of self-knowledge. And I'm probably an example of this. I'm sure I come across as a total, you know, self-righteous dick, as you might say. But I try always to be friendly and polite in these debates, and not to be too dismissive. And that's at all levels. I think almost everybody I met, unless they're sociopathic, psychopathic in some way, you know, dysfunctional in the brain, literally, everybody wants to love and be loved, and to accept and be accepted. And then things in their life history and their makeup have pushed them into and pushed us into attitudes of fragility, aggression, defensiveness, unhappiness, misery, anger, resentment. All kinds of negative feelings come out when we look at the world, and then we spray those feelings. But deep down, we don't want to make enemies of everybody in the world, and to be an enemy and to be misunderstood. And if it's just so much pride keeps us from doing it. I mean, I was saying a year ago, the only thing that will save the culture is an attack from Martians, you know? Because then suddenly we won't have any differences. We'll only have the commonality of being earthlings, and we'll be defending Earth. So the fact that you're black and you're, you know, Indian or you're Russian is of absolutely no importance. They're the enemy. Those are the Martians. We're the earthlings. We'll come together. But I realized even that was rubbish, because COVID-19 is essentially an alien invasion, and far from bringing us all together, it has only exacerbated the mutual enmity and distrust that exists around the world. So I as usual, I'm completely wrong. And I think that the thing you have to bear in mind with anybody you talk to, especially someone of my generation, is that we never saw any of this coming. Almost nobody has predicted the way the world is now. You can look at bits of cyberpunk and bits of this science fiction or this novel and say, yeah, they kind of got, but not really. Not the particular way that we are fucked, and it's a very particular way, is something that nobody has foreseen. So the same people who didn't foresee how we were going to be a year ago are not necessarily to be trusted when they start expatiating on how we're going to be in a year. We just don't know. And I guess the best you can do is to say it's an adventure. We don't know what's going to happen in a year's time. We don't know what America will be like when there's been enough vaccination to have 58 to 60% herd immunity and the economy's come back online. What will the taxes be like? Will the Proud Boys have a 24 hours, 24/7 vigil against Biden and his presidency? Will there be insurrection in the streets at all times, or will we have settled down? Will we just be getting on with, gosh, I can now have a flat white or a latte in the street, and I can walk without a mask between these two offices? Or will we actually have become completely destroyed by the false hope of the vaccinations, because the world will still be so screwed in terms of the economics, the employment outlook, and indeed the continued social distancing that will be necessary because the disease will have mutated and there'll still be other problems. And our patience will have run out by that time, because we just won't be able to take it anymore. Because of the three sciences that have controlled this pandemic, virology and epidemiology. The third is, in a sense, the most fascinating, and that's behaviorology, is how we respond to orders given by government on things like seclusion and sheltering in place and wearing masks and not seeing other people. We can do it for a while, but the time's going to come, isn't it, when I'm going to look out of the window and there'll be a vehicle coming up the hill that will be straight out of Mad Max, and there'll be groups of bandanaed maniacs on it, shooting, killing, raping, and destroying because, hey, they can. Who's going to stop them? This business of there being no grown-ups and no authority, it filters down. And in the, animals, if you leave a house unlived in for 6 months, the birds, the insects know that. They sense there's no one there. They start to nest in it, and they get bolder and bolder, and they start to eat the wood, and they start to move in. Well, why wouldn't they? And it's the same with criminals and the bored and the unemployed. Is, hey, there's no real police force around. There's no one keeping control. They're all scared of us. We can do what we like. Let's go up the hill and go into that house and take everything they've got. They've probably got a cellar full of wine. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but it's perfectly possible that, far from thinking about, I mean, there's an old phrase that is used in reference to the Titanic disaster, which is, it's no good arranging the deck chairs when there's an iceberg coming. You don't just arrange the seating on the deck. You've got to realize how big the crisis is. And maybe your talk of Alexander, of going into the FBI, will there be an FBI in 5 years' time? Will there? Or maybe there will be something which is more like out of a Wesley Snipes or John Travolta movie of the 80s and 90s, in which the future was, RoboCops and things like that. Sorry, I'm speaking it off. I'm sure you've got another question, Elias. Sorry.
Oh, no, of course. And I want to go a little back to your criticism of the tactics that the left is kind of using now, because this is really exactly my critique, the polarizing rhetoric and the divisive slogans that we're kind of using.
Yeah.
Take social justice issues in the past 6 months. You have the slogan of Black Lives Matter is all cops are bastards.
Yeah.
But it's not all cops, it's the system, right? And how is that going to work? Because the first response is, well, not all cops are bastards.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
No, it's failed. So I want to ask you specifically on social justice issues like this. Obama said a couple weeks ago that when you use slogans like this, you're always going to lose people, always. And he was attacked for this by a lot of the left wing, but also, people who consider themselves centrists and liberals as well. So would you agree with this and slogans like this as well being harmful to?
Absolutely, 100%. I think a thing I came to a view on a couple of years ago is it suddenly occurred to me how many people there are in the world who would rather be right than effective. If they care more about the purity of their soul, as it were, than the effectiveness of their actions. And I think that's a disaster. And Obama, of course, having been in a position of trying to get things done for 8 years, usually with the hill not on his side politically, so having to work very doubly hard to get anything done. It naturally understands that the ease with which you can come up with slogans and express an ideologically pure idea, which is, marvelous, but which can have very little traction in the real world and do no more than, as you say, alienate and antagonize those for whom it seems like an insult. There are policemen working in places in America who are saving lives, who are helping young drug addicts get off drugs and are going round see their parents and are making a difference. And of course, there are policemen who are brutal, corrupt thugs. But, if just simply painting them all as that is a disaster for the culture, I think. And yeah, I remember seeing Obama at an event in New York I was at. It was for the United Nations, and he was giving a talk to this group. We were doing this thing about the sustainable goals of the United Nations. And someone said how he had not managed to do this and this and this when he was a president. And how did he think? He said, no, there were so many things I didn't manage to do. He said, I wanted everything not just to be good or better, but to be the best. I wanted the best healthcare. I wanted the best. But you know what? Better is still better than good, and good is better than bad. And anything you can do that is better is better. And it may not be the perfect thing you wanted to do, but it's still better. I mean, it's so obvious that the usual phrase to describe that is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If you're constantly focusing on the perfect outcome for society, then you're turning down chances of things that are good because they aren't perfect. And that's an arrogant attitude, and one that actually allows you to stand back and do nothing, because your fingers will always be clean, you'll always be pure, because you weren't responsible for the compromise, the fudge, the attempt to make it better. You were only interested in making it perfect, so you did nothing. Well, that's no good to anybody. It really isn't. It's much better to get in there and get mucky and try and do things, even if they aren't 100% the answer. They don't do everything you wanted them to do. Are they better than having done nothing? And if you can do things that are better than nothing, then you're on the way. That's in a way the most you can expect of someone. They've made a small difference, a tiny difference. They just made it a little bit better. Not hugely, not perfect. There were still systemic faults. There was still racism in the world. There was still sexism. There was still transphobia in the world after they'd done their little bit. But there was a bit less of this and a bit less of that. And that's good enough, because if everybody is involved in making things a little better, things get a lot better, like cleaning up a beach. If everybody said there's too much, the beach is too filthy, we'll never clean it, then it will stay dirty. But if thousands of people just do a tiny bit of picking up, it's clean in seconds. And it's the power of numbers. And of course, we've been turned off the power of numbers because of our disaffection with social media and the internet now. Having been Pandora's box that was going to make the world perfect, it's now Pandora's box that has released all the ills of the world. And we now feel that everything to do with social media and everything to do with the internet is dark and tainted. And actually, that's probably not right. It's still a powerful force for people to connect with each other across before. And all it requires is for those who control social media to make a decision, which would be a very exciting one. When Mark Zuckerberg was at Harvard, he made the decision to try and write a piece of code to create a program, as they were called. They weren't even called apps in those days, they were called programs, to write a program, a computer program that people would use that would be popular. And as he did and saw that it was successful, he got more ambitious and thought he could do one that would be amazing. And he did, and it got more amazing. He found a financial model for advertising that allowed it not only to grow, but to make his corporation and himself one of the richest people the world had ever seen. Now, all he has to do now is say, okay, I've done that. Now, can I make Facebook the most benign force for good that the world has ever seen? I'm Mark Zuckerberg. I can go in to a board meeting and say, we're going to drop advertising. We're going to become a subscription model like Netflix. We're not going to use advertising. So there'll be no data mining, no data shadowing of people, none of that, because it's not part of who we are anymore. Instead, people just have to pay tuppence a month or whatever, nothing, because there's so many billions, and that will be our subscription base. And we will make sure we can afford it to monitor it in such a way that it is neither left-wing nor right-wing, but what it doesn't allow are lies and dangerous, aggressive pieces of unpleasantness. And we'll fix it as we go, slowly. But we will make sure that this will be the most thrillingly benign and superb organization that the world has yet seen. We can do it. It's a question of willpower. And he has no excuse not to do it. And wouldn't that be exciting? Can you imagine saying this is day one of Facebook, a new Facebook, and everything we do now is aimed towards not our share price and profit, because we're all richer than we could ever need to be, but we're going to get Nobel Prizes out of this. We are going to get Nobel fucking prizes because we are going to make the world so great. We're going to use all our power and muscle and reach to mend everything that's broken that we can. And it'll take time and we'll make mistakes along the way, but that is our aim. Wouldn't you love to do that? He could do it. What's to stop? Jeff Bezos could do the same. His wife's given away 4.2 billion in a week, for God's sake. You know, there's nothing to stop these people from switching and turning themselves into humanitarians of remarkable kind. Now, that sort of, again, I suppose, I've said on the one hand, it takes thousands of us on a beach to clean up the beach. And then I've said, we just need the heads of these companies to clean up the beach, as it were. Well, the fact is, it can be both. We put the pressure on them, and we are, you know, we are people who want to make the world better just because around that we want our own nests to be tidy and to be happy. But we also want the people whom we enrich with our custom to have some bloody sense of responsibility. Anyway, sorry, that's my answer to that one.
I'd agree. You know, sadly, it feels optimistic seeing a figure like, you know, Bezos or the Mark Zuckerberg, actually, given, you know, the statements and decisions he made recently, having this, you know, change in vision and deciding he's going to use his platform as a force for good. But anyway,
I know you're right, but it is a mystery. Just as on a human level, I can't understand. Can you, being such a person who wouldn't want to make everything right? But sorry, carry on.
But I want to ask in terms of, you know, doing a little better, or, you know, better being more than good, or as someone who I see as, you know, a little better, Joe Biden. You know, you talked about how you feel about Obama, but with Biden taking office in January, despite what, you know, a significantly large portion of our country still thinks, you know, do you feel that Biden is, you know, a little better, or do you see his presidency as being progressive, or do you see this as, you know, unproductive or returning to some kind of old administration, as many have criticized him to be?
Well, the truest aphorism about politics is that all politics ends in failure. There's no question there will be disasters and scandals awaiting Biden that he and we have no knowledge of. We can't imagine, you know, let's invent a name. What's this? This is a lens clean. So there will be a piece of paper that comes across his desk one day that says the lens clean affair. And he'll look at it and go, what's this lens clean affair? Oh, it was a small thing. We'll forget about it. And then a couple of days later, the journalist will say, Mr. President, the lens clean affair. Yeah, that's sorry, that's no problem. And what's going on? Well, we did make the mistake. Well, just pretend we didn't. And then there's been a cover-up of the lens clean affair. And suddenly the lens clean affair is the story of the year. Nobody talks about anything else. He never saw it coming. It's disrupted and tripped up all his progress, and a lot of his political credit is used up. This will happen. What that particular affair or scandal or problem will be, as by definition, we can't know, but it will happen. There will be, in a year's time, you can just guarantee there will be this story that will have done damage to the presidency. But yes, he's a little better. Obviously, he's better in terms of the respect and pride that America can have in itself, not to be controlled by this, you know, gibbering, malignant narcissist is obviously a good thing. It was beyond a joke to have the endless insanity of poor Trump. I mean, I say poor Trump, obviously, you know, it's hard to feel sorry for him, really, but when someone is so devoid of any moral compass, I mean, it's disturbing that they can be leader of the free world, as the phrase has it, and it will be a relief to see him gone. And I hope that the journalists will be wise enough not to cover every tweet he tweets in which he attacks Biden, because he'll do it certainly until he gets bored, and he'll get bored if people don't cover it. But everything Biden does, he will attack, and say, I would have done it better, and when I did it, and all that. And if journalists repeat that and print it, because it's obviously it gets eyeballs and clicks, it would be a big shame. But no, he'll be a disappointment. Even Obama was a disappointment in a sense. He couldn't do it all. Clinton was obviously a disappointment in his way too. You just hope for stability is important, both globally and within the country. Some element of stability. And I have admired the fact that Biden has barely referenced Trump's temper tantrums and refusals to play ball. He's done it on a couple of occasions just to make sure that people know that he's still around and that he's noticing. But he hasn't harped on about it and sort of spoken every day. He hasn't whined himself, and that's kind of graceful and dignified and the correct attitude. And if he can have an administration that is graceful and dignified and doesn't speak too much and gets on with it and is a bit dull, it has sort of dull news conferences and dull, press events, and doesn't get overexcited about itself and doesn't blow its own trumpet, and just, takes all the pressure and heat, or not all, but most of the pressure and heat out of the daily business of politics, just calms it down a bit. I think that would have an immense effect, even irrespective of the politics. That would be true if it was a Republican who took over from Trump. So I can't think of many, but a few of them might at least have been, well, they would have been better, certainly. Yeah.
So Biden's filled his administration with a lot of so-called interventionists, figures like Neera Tandem and Tony Blinken, who say supported invading Iraq, Libya, and you associate yourself with the Labour Party in Britain, and I imagine oppose the war in Iraq. So what would your response be to these kinds of interventionist policies?
Interventionist is used in two ways, of course. In economic terms, interventionism is all about the state helping guide economics through its fiscal policy, hands-on, which is a more progressive way of running the economy. But you mean interventionist around the world in terms of involving itself in global events. And obviously I worry about that, and I would hate to see any more adventures like Iraq, and I would hate to see the situation with Iran being escalated, because that's it, could be in danger of exploding. That there is an ironic truth about international relations, that it is hardline right-wing leaders who have historically most often brought about peaceful settlements. It was Menachem Begin, and it was Nixon who came to terms with China first, for example, and it was Thatcher and Reagan who came to terms with Gorbachev and Russia, and they were on the further right edge of things. So it is an annoying fact of progressive politics that they tend to screw up the international side royally. There's an old phrase that you forgive a left-wing administration for being inefficient, but you'd never forgive it for being corrupt. You'd forgive a right-wing administration for being corrupt, but you wouldn't forgive it for being inefficient. And I think it's obviously completely over the top as an absolute answer to these things. But generally speaking, yes, Biden is not, he's not AOC, he's not the absolute progressive end of the Democratic Party. He's not Bernie Sanders. He is a pragmatist, and he has lain down with figures whose politics I would certainly quarrel with, and many on the progressive side of politics would be uncomfortable with. But I think it's again an example of let's try and get better things done and not moan about the fact that we haven't brought about the golden time in one swift election, because to believe that we could, or to be so pernickety and so, what is the word or phrase, but so above the fray that we refuse to dirty our hands in compromise and the business of getting on with sorting out things like Medicare and the whole welfare issues that are going to be a huge problem for the government for the next years. I mean, to pay for the trillions of dollars that have gone into COVID relief, to pay for that, to get some sense of fairness out of it for the millions who've been thrown into unemployment and poverty, who are using food banks, all these things. I should hope, frankly, that there is almost no foreign policy to think about when in the next 2 years. I never liked America first, but for once I might actually think, yes, America first, Sweden first, Lithuania first, Russia first. Every individual country has just got to get on with sorting out its own mess economically, and let's just hope that China and Russia aren't so malevolent that they would use the opportunity of the world crisis to do something utterly disastrous, because that obviously would. I don't like the idea of Joe Biden having to face off against the Chinese Navy on some island in the Pacific, or suddenly coming face to face with such an egregious breach of cybersecurity from Russia that there was no response other than either a response in kind with an attack on Russia's cybersecurity that was blatant, or indeed something even more escalating. Because no, I don't see Biden as a world statesman in that way, but I don't see Trump as that either, or any other figure particularly that I know of in politics who is a world statesman, who one could say, oh, they'll calm it all down. But yeah, I mean, who knows?
So more on foreign policy, I want to shift to a close friend of yours and one who I admire as well, Christopher Hitchens, who shares your view on religion. Obviously, you debated alongside, defended to an extent the Iraq War, and I do believe he was unfairly castigated by the left wing for supporting the Iraq War. But how did you two specifically differ on this?
Yes, I mean, you couldn't but respect any opinion that Christopher had, because it came backed up with such ferocious learning and such extraordinary rhetoric that you were always at a disadvantage if you disagreed, because he could make you look so foolish. But because we were friends, I could have digs at him, and obviously it was a puzzle to his friends that he should have been so immediately and aggressively for a military response to 9/11. A lot of it goes back to his visceral hatred of the Clintons. I mean, that is a deep part of Christopher's makeup over the period of the Clinton presidency. He learned to distrust and dislike Clinton, and of course, if someone comes from roughly the same side of politics as you do, and then the betrayal is real and hurtful. You can't be betrayed by somebody you disagree with. So it's the fact that he had thought more highly of Clinton, and just was revolted by what he saw as his corruption and paltering and his lack of good faith and all these things. So he was truly. And he always claimed he knew something about the Clintons that he couldn't tell me, and that, oh, if you knew, and so on. But I said, yes, but look at what you've said about Vietnam, look at what you've said about so many of the flare-ups over the 60s and 70s that you covered, you went to physically as a foreign correspondent and a war journalist on many occasions. And your ability to describe the absurdity of American foreign policy in Guatemala and El Salvador, Nicaragua and Honduras, and in Cuba, and in everywhere, and obviously in the Indochina, in Vietnam and Cambodia, and somehow everything's different here. And he would then talk about the ideology of Islamofascism, and I would say I agree, but is that the reason? Because Islamofascism is so much worse of philosophy than the communism of Ho Chi Minh and Castro, because they were pretty filthy. They tortured and they killed and they murdered and they bombed, and they supported bombers. They supported people who put bombs on airplanes. They paid for those bombs to be put on airplanes. So, and that's what I couldn't really, it's a very tricky one, isn't it? Is the fact of terrorism itself the evil, or is it that the justification isn't quite good enough? Because I'm Jewish, say, so I grew up hearing from some elements of my family about the heroism of the Stern Gang and Irguts, who were two terrorist organizations in Jerusalem in the 1940s, who put bombs in the King David Hotel and bombed and killed and assassinated British soldiers who were running the so-called Palestinian Mandate and so on. And then a more obvious case is the British government and the Americans paid French resistance activists to put bombs in Parisian restaurants where there were Nazis dining. And did we think that was terrorism? No, it was the French resistance. It was freedom fighting. These questions are still as thorny as ever they were. So the act of the bomb is not always unforgivable. Is that what's being said? It's a really tricky one to accept, but it seems it is, because we gave medals to members of the French resistance who put bombs in hotels and restaurants and killed innocent people, and some of whom were, yes, collaborators, but many of whom were bystanders. So it is just about, oh, this terrorism is bad because I don't think their case is strong enough. Well, that's no way to live in the world, is it? That terrorism's okay as long as you've got a good cause. I mean, that can't be right. A bomb on a plane is a bomb on a plane, isn't it? And if it's been put there by someone from a communist cell or a Islamic cell, it's the same thing. The flesh and the bones are being torn apart by the explosion in the same way, and children are being denied parents and parents denied children as a result of it. And it's a pity and a scandal and a shame and a horror. And I know it's feeble, it's the liberal mimsy, oh, I can't, ooh, it's all so sad, I wish we were nicer to each other kind of thing. But there was a brutality, no, not a brutality, there was a strength, a commitment to Christopher that I couldn't share. And it was the same with religion. We did a debate in the Hay-on-Wye Festival, years ago. It was one of the first times we did a debate together, and I don't think it was recorded on camera, but it was about offending religious people, essentially. And I said that, well, I said to you a bit earlier that I have no interest in offending religious people. If they fall to their knees and believe that God is watching them, it's none of my business. And it's cruel to mock someone for what they believe. And Christopher just laughed and said, you just don't want anyone to dislike you, do you? And I said, no. And he said, that means everybody will dislike you. And I said, I know, it's terrible. I am far too determined not to be offensive. And that in itself is a bit offensive. But when it comes to when it comes to things like supporting a war, if you're a member of a country that has a nuclear capability, vast resources, and is part of an alliance, which is the biggest force on earth, NATO, together with America and everything, your power is so great that it's no good talking about here's right and here's wrong. It is a bit like the Me Too debate. It's about Harvey Weinstein is not the same as a boyfriend in a flat. He's a man of power. That's why everyone was so angry, because of the enormous power he had over life and death in Hollywood. And so when America decides to involve itself, it's not the same as a neighboring country. It's a huge act of might, Macht, as the Germans call it, and might is a very frightening thing in the world. In a sense, you might argue that the history of the Enlightenment is a history of the loosening of screws on organisms and institutions and systems that exerted pressure and might over people, and that those screws are loosened, whether it's the church or the state or the army, that the free thinking in the 18th and early 19th centuries and then onwards, that sort of allowed the democratization and the involvement of universal suffrage and universal education and all those things, all that was about reducing the power that was put in the hands of the state. And we're now in the situation where we're worried about the fact that all that power is now in individuals' hands in social media, and maybe it should go back to being in the state. And I, of course, am as confused as I ever was about which is better. I think in the end, of course, it's right to have that power is brought to account, and that the levers of power are loosened, or literally the nuts and the bolts are loosened on it. So it's much harder for anybody to destroy the world with one act of madness. At least one hopes it is. Anyway, I'm babbling, carry on.
I agree on foreign policy, but of course Hitchens was absolutely unrivaled in his skills as a debater, so I can imagine how difficult that must be.
It was,
right.
And it was funny, because he was the thing that always mitigated. He was so witty, he was very hard to be truly offended. Extraordinary man. I wish you could have met him. He would have had so much use in this current situation, wouldn't he? Just involving himself in podcasts like this and in Zooms and various other events. It's just a voice that we no longer have except in memory. But I would urge anybody listening who may say, who is this Christopher Hitchens of which we speak? Is just go to YouTube and devote a day to Hitch slaps and other moments in which you'll see Christopher Hitchens being interviewed on MSNBC and this and that and the other, all the TV channels, all the various different things, and you will see a spirit of a kind that comes around once every 200 or 300 years, and you'll think, damn, I wish I'd paid attention when he was alive.
Right. And there was one debate that I know Elia has seen, I have seen, where you kind of debated with him on the Catholic Church. And I believe the exact words you said was at one point was the idea that the Catholic Church serves to disseminate the word of the Lord is nonsense. Right.
Yes.
And it seems that the Catholic Church is kind of, for lack of a better word, grasping at straws a little bit. We've seen a statement come out from the Pope that was saying it was okay for people of the same sex to be in civil unions, which was surprising. What exactly are your opinions on the Catholic Church? Just to clarify for the viewers and listeners who aren't exactly aware.
Well, at the time of that debate, they were pretty negative. The motion for the debate was, this House believes that the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world, and Christopher Hitchens and I opposed that motion. It was put forward by an archbishop, an African archbishop, and by a British politician called Anne Widdecombe, who was a member of the Catholic Church. And this was at the time when Ratzinger was Pope Benedict, and they were still really not coming to terms with the enormous legacy of child abuse that had been uncovered over the years by various people. And they had not really apologized for it. They had not really, as I said, sort of manned up, as we might say, fessed up, and at the same time, nor had they in any way modified their opposition to gay rights and abortion rights, and there were still nuns in Africa putting out black propaganda about condoms causing AIDS. I mean, it really was that bad, and it wasn't that long ago. So I was pretty extreme, I suppose you might say, in my enmity of the church and its power, because the Catholic Church is a special case when it comes to sects and types of Christianity, let alone other religions, in that it is considered the mother church, and it has its greatest reach. The tentacles of the octopus may, reach out from all the way from Rome to South America, and specifically to the poorest. It's always to the poorest and least educated. The Catholic Church has been against science and against education and against poor relief because the poor and the ignorant are their fuel, that's what their cash, that's what they live on, it's what they feast on, it's what they need. They're never going to survive as this giant edifice if they appeal to people whom they convert in the way that the Baptists and the what used to be called the dissenting churches, the non-Catholic churches. They're the fundamentalist churches, and they are evangelical. Their aim is to convert. That's never really been quite what the Catholic Church was about. It was not quite to convert or to bring about a being born again, or one of these Protestant things like the election that Calvinists believe in. But it was always about a membership of the church, being embraced into the folds of the church and being obedient to the church's teachings. The church has teachings. Whatever one thinks about Protestantism and evangelicalism, it believes that the Bible has teachings, and that you can personally have a relationship with God yourself on your knees with that Bible and the Word of God, and you don't need the intercession of a bishop or a priest. The Catholic Church insists on that intercession. And I'm dwelling on this theology and historical difference because it's the reason the Catholic Church is different. And it has therefore always been against any loosening of the shackles in which the working class and the peasant class in particular are held. And so the vicious relationship the Catholic Church has had with fascists and militarist juntas, and in suppressing communism, not just communism, I'm talking about social democracy. There was a liberation theology, this theology which was young Catholic priests would go in and bring about social change, inspired by the teachings of Christ. They would bring about social change in their countries. The Catholic Church excommunicated them, banned them from the priesthood, literally threw them out, because the generals and who gave so much money to the church, and the Franco and people like that in Spain, of course, absolutely insisted that this had nothing to do with Catholicism, which was all about hierarchy. There was Christ the King at the top, and the only way to him was through a priest, and the only way the priest had was through another priest, through a cardinal, through a monsignor, through the Pope himself. It was this structure that still exists and is so powerful that makes the Catholic Church so particularly strong in its adherence and its insistence on obedience. But having said that, and it's ironic I should be saying it as a non-Christian, I do believe in redemption, and I do believe things can improve. That the real problem with the Catholic Church is that it is stuck between and it knows it is, two impossible truths. They can't both be true. One is that it believes it stands as a bastion for all truth and for absolute truth against the relativism of the post-Enlightenment scientific world, which believes in moral relativism, and the church will not accept that. So that's one view, the church is absolute. But the other view is when you talk to them about their relationship to slavery and to Nazism and to fascism, they will say, oh yes, but we have changed, we have learned. Well, how did you need to learn? If you were the source of all moral good, who taught you? Why? I tell you who taught you. The post-Enlightenment culture taught you that slavery was bad, and that all these and that it was okay to be gay, and that it was all right, under circumstances, if you've been raped, maybe to terminate your pregnancy, and that things aren't as clear cut as they appeared to be 300 years ago. So in fact, maybe there is a little bit of relativism to the morality of this world. And so, I mean, for example, I've heard Catholic priests excusing child abuse by saying it wasn't such a big deal 100 years ago. Well, if it wasn't such a big deal 100 years ago, where were you? You were the arbiter of all morality 100 years ago. So are you saying morality has changed? And if you're saying morality has changed, you have immediately destroyed this idea that you stand for something eternal. You actually stand, like all human institutions, as a slowly evolving thing that accrues wisdom by experience and learning, not through the Bible or through the Word of God, but through man discovering how things are. And of course, that is the state of the church. It has been taught about human rights by people from outside the church. It hasn't come to the view that human rights are important and should be valued and understood. It hasn't come to that view that women are as deserving of education as men. It hasn't come to that view from inside. It's been taught it from outside. And it knows that, and it drives it mad, because by admitting that, they're admitting that the church is not what they've always said it was. Do you see what I mean? There is an inbuilt misfortune in being a Catholic. In order to admit that things have improved, you have to admit that the church learnt from the secular world. And the secular world is what teaches us, is what gives us the authority to understand, slowly, making mistakes along the way, new thoughts about the environment and nature and children and women and different races and sexuality and gender, all these complicated things that were once thought to be absolute, we now understand are relative. I'm not saying everything is fluid and there's no such thing as good, and no such thing as bad. That's nonsense. But it is that it's only by working through issues of morality and ethics, by looking at them afresh, by looking at them empirically, by seeing what works and what doesn't work, that you can come to new ways of living and new ways of granting the supreme gift of the right to be who they feel they're born to be to citizens of the world, and not to interfere with them or to buffet them or tamp them down, tamp their spirit and their self-belief. Priests in my lifetime, I have friends who are at schools in Ireland who were beaten for writing with their left hands, these children. You will be right-handed. Yes, you will. That's the least of the wickednesses that these fathers and brothers inflicted on children. So, the church has to understand and admit, and Francis is kind of doing that it has learnt from the rest of the world, that it hasn't taught us how to behave. There is no element of Catholic teaching which you'll go, oh yes, thank goodness the Catholics have taught us that. Now we know at least to do this. Nothing. Anything they say that you'll say, well, no, that's Socrates was there before you on that one. Or no, that was scrawled on a cave in 5,000 years ago. What are you saying? No, Buddha said that before you did. There are all kinds of ways you can show that the Catholic Church has offered nothing except fabulous, rich architecture picture. But if you took the carpenter of Bethlehem, Jesus, and led him by the hand to Rome and stood him outside St. Peter's Rome with the marble, was this what you had in mind, Jesus? I think he'd go, what the fuck have you done? What is that cathedral doing there? Oh, I thought that's what you meant, isn't it? By saying, follow me and drop everything and, love your neighbor as yourself. Didn't you mean build an enormous palace for rich priests who could call themselves princes of the church? It's just such nonsense, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of hardly worth saying, and yet one has to. And unfortunately, it is such a cult of identity Catholicism that people who are born into it feel they are specially somehow, oh, I was born a Catholic, you see, I'm a lapsed Catholic. Well, there's this kind of hold that it has over people. For decades after they've last been to confession, they will still say, some Catholics, about, I still feel awful about. And you think, but what? What is it? Anyway.
Thank you again for joining us, Stephen.
This has been a real pleasure. And I want to congratulate you and thank you for asking me, but above all, to encourage you. This is great work you're doing. And to all who are listening, remember that politicians are not another class of person. They are you and me deciding to go to that meeting and putting our hand up when someone says, oh, can we have someone to help with ... Oh, well, yeah, I'll do that. And then maybe in a few months' time, you'll be standing and making a speech. And or maybe you'll still be in the background handing out flyers at meetings or whatever. But politics is you. It's not other people. And it's only when we recognize that we are all politicians that we'll stop saying, God, don't you hate politicians? Because we'll be saying, don't you hate yourself? And that's ridiculous. Anyway, sorry. Just wanted to say.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Fry, or Stephen, that is.
It's a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to continue to support us, you can do so by checking out our Instagram pages at YIP Institute and at Watch Verbum. You can also look at our website at www.yipinstitute.com. Make sure to follow our page as we upload weekly. Have a good day.